I'm gonna show you how I made this knife in Blender from start to finish. This is usually what I do for my clients, and this is how you make money with Blender, so buckle up. Every single modeling tool and technique that you're gonna see me use in this video is gonna be in my upcoming ebook, so you can pre-order that. I'll put the link below. I took a screenshot from the company's Instagram and I'm gonna use that as a reference. So press Shift A, image, reference, and load up the picture. Obviously this can be any picture in the world. Now hopefully I don't get sued by this company for using their image in my videos, but I need to rotate this and I'm gonna do it so that I can align it with my axes. It's gonna be a little bit easier to model this if it's aligned with the x-axis rather than if it's sitting at 45 degrees or something. Now I also wanna have a little bit of transparency on this image, so I'm gonna go over here, I'll check opacity, and I'll reduce that to something like 0.26 or something. Now I'm just going to replace the default cube with a plane, because that way when I rescale it, I don't have to worry about the thickness yet. So now I'm just gonna reshape that and use it to model the handle. Now I'm going to model the bottom of the handle and the handle itself in the same mesh. I'm just going to maybe apply a little bevel here to make a little gap here. The main reason for that is because I want to have a smooth transition between the two materials. I don't want this to be a different angle. So I'm going to place this plane over here on the bottom of this handle, and I can just extrude this edge step by step to shape out the bottom of the handle first. It's not so important that it's super technically accurate, it just has to look good. Now once I have the rough shape for the bottom part, now I'm gonna start shaping the top part. Now the top part has this kind of waving shape over here because this is where your fingers go around the handle so you can get a better grip. So I'm gonna make some loop cuts on the tops and the bottoms of those bumps, and that way I have some extra geometry that I can move up or down to create these little curves. Now don't worry, we're gonna subdivide this in a minute so it's gonna be smooth. It's not gonna stay clunky like this, but if you're making this shit for a video game, then maybe you want it to stay clunky and low poly because it's gonna perform a little bit better in a game engine. Now let's also extrude the top part and maybe add an extra edge here in the middle just to control the shape a little bit better. And the top part of the handle at the top here is a little bit different than this part, so we have to adjust that as well. Now I just have to take this whole surface and extrude it to give it some thickness. I don't know how thick it is exactly, but again, it doesn't matter too much as long as it's something that looks pretty reasonable like this. Now I'm going to subdivide this object by selecting it and pressing Ctrl 3 in object mode. You can also go over here and add your subdivision surface modifier through this menu right here. And now you can see it looks like my mesh is a lot smoother and nicer, and it has a much more of an organic kind of shape. So we're still going to add some supporting loops to control this geometry a little bit better. First I'm going to make a loop cut right here around the entire handle, and I'm going to bevel that with Ctrl B to turn it into two supporting loops, one for the top and one for the bottom. And this is important because when you add an extra loop cut near a surface, it kind of tightens up the shape when you have subdivision surface on. So we want to have this on both sides. Now if you want to be cool, you can select some of the faces in the front here, and maybe you can scale them down to make this part a little bit more round, or you can also push it forward to change the shape a little bit. At the top here, I'm going to take some of the geometry, I'm going to slide it up almost all the way to the top, and I'll do the same thing at the bottom because I want the edges at the top and the bottom at the end of the handle, at the top of the handle, I want them to be a little bit sharper. And we're going to make it a little bit sharper still just in a second. Now I'm going to delete all the faces in the front, because if I delete those faces, there's going to be a straight sharp cutoff at the end, which is exactly what we need because we're going to have a nice metal piece to protect your hand. I don't know what the fuck you call this part of the knife. Someone tell me in the comments, but it's the part that you use on a sword if you go to kill somebody, or if you're fighting somebody in a sword fight and they hit you with their sword is going to get stuck on this part. I don't know what this is called on a knife or on a sword, but this is, I guess, is the equivalent on a knife. Now we're going to add some smooth shading to this object, and since we do want to make this cool as fuck, we're going to select this edge loop that goes right around this part which separates the steel bottom and the wooden part of the handle. The reason we're selecting it is because we're about to make a tiny little gap here. And to create this little gap, once we selected this entire edge loop with Alt right click, I'm going to press Ctrl B and I'll hold down Shift to make the smallest possible bevel on this edge. And once I've done that, I'll press E to extrude and I'll right click, and then I'll press Alt S at the same time, and I'm also going to hold Shift to just gently push this inwards. Now it looks like we have a little gap between these two parts of the knife. You can also add some more supporting loops to make sure that this part is not too round, but there's hardly any difference visible, so you don't really have to do that. Now when it comes to these little circles on the handle, we're going to take care of those when we're texturing this thing, so we're just going to forget about it for now. Next we're going to make this little metal piece, which is what separates the blade from the handle. I don't know what the hell this is for, somebody please tell me. So we're going to create a plane, but this time we're going to rotate it by 90 degrees on the y-axis, so we flip it sideways. Now again, we have to reshape it a little bit. It has to be a little bit thicker than the handle itself, and we have to make it a bit longer as well. The length we can figure out from the reference picture, so we can just adjust the vertices and move them back and forth according to the reference image, but we can't really tell the height, so I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it and make it something like this. Maybe we'll adjust it later to make it fit better. Once we've done that, I'm going to press Ctrl 2 to add 2 levels of subdivision. And I'm also going to add some more supporting loops to control this shape a little bit better. Again, I can't really see the shape from the front, so I'm just gonna do something that I think looks pretty cool for this. I don't know if this is supposed to be a perfect semicircle here and a perfect semicircle here. I don't know if it can be a little bit elliptical. I don't know. I'm just gonna do something that I think looks cool. Now I'm going to extrude this out to give it some thickness. I'll select this face in the back, and I'll hold Ctrl Shift and right click on this face in the back to select all 3 of those. Then I'm going to hold Shift to select this face, and I'm going to hold Ctrl Shift right click on this face to select the front faces as well. Now I can press I to inset them, and that's going to create this supporting edge loop around here. I'm also going to make a loop cut over here, which I'm going to bevel to create some extra support this way. Now I'm going to select some of the edges from the front here, and I'll slide them backwards just a little bit, and maybe I'll take some faces in the front and scale them down on the Z-axis a little bit. Maybe I'll push them forward on the X-axis. That's just because I want to make it look a little bit more natural. I don't want this to be too perfect. So once we have the rough shape for this, again, object, shade smooth, and we're good to go. I'm going to add a loop cut around the entire knife, and I'm going to leave this one in the middle. The reason I'm adding this is because this way I can take the vertices from the top and the bottom of the back of the top of the handle, and I can move those forward on the Y-axis just to give this a bit more of a curved shape here. While I'm at it, I'm also going to do the same thing in the front. Now I'm going to move this little piece of steel forward just a little bit, just so I can place it right on the edge between this and the handle. Now this is going to make the handle look a little bit more natural. Currently there's just a completely unrealistic cut that goes right on top of the handle. So I'm going to fill this edge loop in the front here. I'm going to press I to inset to make a little edge loop that goes around here, or a little face loop, or whatever you want to call it. Then with X, I'm going to delete this face. We had a really tight corner here when insetting, so I'm going to move these vertices apart a little bit. And now I'm also going to add a supporting edge loop that goes around here. This way, instead of having a completely straight laser cut, we have a little bit of a bevel right here, which makes it look a little bit more realistic if you're looking at it closely. Now we get to the fun part. We're going to model the blade itself. This is the part that goes into the other man. So we're going to go to top view, and once again, we're going to use a plane to start modeling this. I don't like to scale my shit in object mode because that changes the scale of the object, which is going to give you some problems when you're beveling. It might mess up some other things. So I just like to scale my shit in edit mode and to keep the scale on 1. Now let's take a look at this blade for a second if we're going to do this right. You can probably also do this with normal maps or something, but I don't want to fuck with normal maps. I want to actually create this blade. So we're going to do this right. Notice how this side of the blade, it's completely flat at just one surface. And then this is the part that's kind of sanded or ground down, or what do you call this? When you're sharpening the knife, you're kind of grinding the side at an angle. So this surface is sitting at a different angle from this. So we're going to have to model these 2 surfaces separately and then figure out a way to connect them. So I'm going to use this plane to model out the sharp part of the knife. And to do that, I'm just extruding vertices and moving them around a little bit. Just basic modeling technique. I'm going to add some extra geometry so I can align this with my blueprint here. I don't know if you can call this a blueprint, but you know what I mean. And keep in mind that this part at the bottom of the knife, this is the sharpest part of the knife. So this is once again going to have a slightly different angle. Before we get to that, let's also extrude this part at the very top here. And this is going to be more like a triangle. So we're just going to extrude this one edge and slide this one vertex all the way to the end by pressing double G. When you do this, make sure you go to Mesh, Merge, and Merge by Distance. Because when you slide something, now you have 2 vertices in the same place, and you don't want to have that. That's going to give you problems. So just select both of them, Mesh, Merge by Distance. Now let's add an extra loop cut over here. And we're going to align this with the sharpest part of the knife down here. We can see the little white shade on this part. At the very tip of the knife, I'm going to slide this vertex a little bit, just so I can reshape this. This way we can lift this face up and we're going to have a sort of bevel over here. Right now we got some twisting on our faces, but once we apply a subdivision surface modifier, it's not going to matter. Now we need to make this slightly angled, but we can't just rotate it around the x-axis. Because if we rotate this around the x-axis, it's going to change its shape because we're looking at it from a different angle now. So we can't have that. So here's how we can angle this properly. I'm going to select this entire surface, which is currently completely flat. If it's not completely flat, make sure it's completely flat by pressing S, Z, and 0 to scale it to 0 on the Z axis. Now go down here to your shear tool, and this is going to give you some gizmos that you can use to control this tool. Here's what it does. We're going to take this slider on the right side, which is pointing upwards, and we're going to drag that upwards. That's going to tilt our surface without actually changing its shape. So from top view, it looks exactly the same, but it's sitting in a different angle. Obviously, you don't want to take it this far. I'm just trying to demonstrate the tool for you. Now you can go to front view and scale it down on the Z axis to control how angled you want this to be. But this other edge down here, which which is the sharpest part of the knife, we're going to have to lower that a little bit further. Make sure you don't also select this part when you're selecting this. Just select the part which is supposed to be sharp and pointy. We're also going to deselect this vertex at the hook part over here because this is supposed to be at the height of this surface up here. So we just want to lower everything else. And we're going to lower this just a little bit like this. The main thing we're trying to accomplish by lowering it is just so it has slightly different shading here, so you can see that it's sitting at a different angle. Now we need to start making the flat part of the knife, the side of the knife, the cheek of the knife, let's say. So we're going to make sure that this part makes up an entire surface up here. But to do that, we have to make sure that it's completely flat. Currently, if you look at it from front view, you can see that it's not flat because we also angled this with a shear tool. We don't want that, so we're just going to press S, Z, and 0 to scale this to 0 on the Z axis. Ideally, we want to level this with this point right here, so I'm going to place my 3D cursor on this part right here with Shift S, cursor to selected. I'll set my 3D cursor as a pivot point, then I'll select this edge loop right here, and I'll scale it to 0 on the Z axis. This way it's going to level this selection with the 3D cursor on the Z axis. Now we can start trying to figure out how we're going to fill this in. So currently we have two vertices right here which define the edge, and we need to make new vertices to connect with each of these vertices down here, okay? So we have to have the same number of vertices, which means we're going to need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new vertices on this part right here. So we can extrude this, right click and move it along the x-axis once, extrude, right click, slide along the x-axis once, and just repeat this a couple of times until you have enough vertices to connect everything. When you get to the top part, you want to make sure everything is aligned, so snap your 3D cursor to this by pressing Shift S, cursor to selected. Take this one, SX0, to scale it to 0 on the x-axis to align these two vertices perfectly. Now we can select all these edges right here, and we're going to deselect the edge at the end. We're going to press W, bridge edge loops, and this is instantly going to connect all those edges. I'm going to extrude this edge one more time, right click and slide it back on the x-axis, then I'll extrude it again and push it down here so I get to the bottom of the knife. Currently there's a gap between this part and the blade itself. It's supposed to be that way. We're going to connect this in a moment. Right now we need some more geometry to make this kind of pointy curved part down here, so we're going to add some more loop cuts so we can control this. Keep in mind that we are going to use a subdivision surface modifier with this, so this is going to be nice and smooth. Now I notice it's kind of a weird shape over here. It's curved downwards, so I'm going to add an extra edge loop right here. I now have the same number of edges up here as I do at the bottom, so I can connect this perfectly, but I can also control the shape of this a little bit better. We can even add another loop cut right here so we have some more control over the shape. But currently this is a triangle, which means when we add a loop cut up here, it's going to turn into a quad, which means if we want to add some more geometry over here so we can connect this, it's going to go straight around this edge loop and it's going to go over here to the side. We don't want this, we want to connect these two. So we're going to select these edges up here on the top. We're going to slide them by pressing double G. We're going to bring them over here. We're going to click, then select everything, go to mesh, merge, and merge by distance. Now I use this merge by distance shit all the time, so I set a shortcut for this. You can do that by finding the tool, right clicking, and go to change shortcut, and it's going to ask you to type in whatever shortcut you want to use for this. I use Shift W because this is what they use in the old versions of Blender. That's what I'm used to, but you can do whatever you want. So now that we have this extra edge loop, we can slide it back and forth. We can move this edge around a little bit. We can reshape this however we want. You can do this as many times as you like. Now we still have to take care of this part, so we're gonna have to lower this geometry so it connects down with the sharp part of the knife. To do that, let's place our 3D cursor on a vertex which is on the sharp part of the knife. Then I'm going to go to edge select mode. I'll select some edges from the top here. E, right click, and scale to 0 on the Z axis with the 3D cursor set as a pivot point. Now I can just go back to vertex select mode. I'll take this vertex, Shift S, selection to cursor. This way it's gonna snap to this part over here. Now we also have to fill in the other side of this knife. So with our 3D cursor still in place here, let's select all the edges on the back side of the knife, or at least the ones which are on top of the flat face. We're not gonna do the ones on the point of the knife yet. Now again, press E to extrude, right click to snap it back into place, C, Z, 0, and now they're going to be perfectly aligned with the 3D cursor and the sharp part of the knife. Now I notice there's some weird shit happening with the blade of this knife. The tip of the knife is at a higher point than this edge right here. Obviously they should all be perfectly aligned, they should all be in a straight line apart from this curve. So on the Z axis they should all have the same value, which means we fucked up, but it's okay because we can fix it. So we're going to place the 3D cursor on this edge which is at the middle of the knife or in the middle of the blade. Then we're going to control right click onto the edge which is on the other side of the blade. Then we're going to control right click on this other edge which is at the top of the sharp part. Then we're going to press S, Z, and scale to 0 on the Z axis. As you can see, this messes up our shape quite a bit, but don't worry, we're going to fix that in a second. We're also going to have to do something about this part right here, but we don't just want to scale this to 0, we want this part to be gradually moving upwards. So to do that, we can just slide it all the way to the end with double G, and then we can slide it back the other way again until we bring it somewhere into a position where it makes sense. Now this other edge loop should also have the same height from here to here. So we're gonna place the 3D cursor on this edge, control right click here to select all these edges in between, then press SZ0 one more time. And now this edge loop is aligned with this one over here. We'll do the same thing over here. Shift S, selection the cursor, control right click, scale everything to 0 on the Z axis. And now we pull our shit together in terms of the topology of this knife a little bit. I'll place my 3D cursor over here, extrude this edge, right click, scale to 0 on the Z axis. And this part at the front here is gonna be a little triangle. It doesn't have to be a triangle. You can also slide this edge all the way to the front. Now you're gonna have a quad, but I don't like to have a quad where two edges are completely parallel. They just extend from each other. So I'm gonna keep this as a triangle. Now we have exactly one half of the knife, so we can just duplicate this and take it to the other side. To do that, I'll place my 3D cursor somewhere exactly in the middle of this knife. You might want to clean your shit up a little bit by making sure that everything is in the same height. So you can select this entire edge loop or vertex loop that goes around here, which is at the bottom of the knife. So this will be the blade, this will be the bottom of this, the bottom of the back side, the tip of the knife, and all that. Scale that to 0 on the Z axis with the 3D cursor placed on one of these vertices. This is going to be the exact middle of your blade. Now select everything, Shift D, right click, S0 -1 to scale this to -1 on the Z axis, which is going to reflect it on the Z axis from the 3D cursor right here. When you do this, it's very important that you press Shift N to correct the normals, and also once again go to Mesh, Merge, and Merge by Distance, or use your shortcut. We're gonna have to place the blade exactly in the middle of the knife. So to do that accurately, we're going to select this edge loop on the back of the blade right here, Shift S, cursor to selected, then go to Object Mode, Object Menu, Set Origin, Origin to 3D cursor. Now we can easily snap this object to the middle of the knife. So we're going to select the face over here, Shift S, cursor to selected, that snaps the 3D cursor to the middle of this surface. Now select this object, Shift S, selection the cursor, and it's exactly in the middle of the knife. You can move it back and forth a little bit, just make sure you don't move it up and down, because right now it's exactly in the middle, so you don't want to fuck that up. Now we're going to add some subdivision surface to this knife. So to do that, Object, Control 3 or something. When you apply subdivision surface, you're going to notice that your knife becomes a lot more dull. It doesn't look right anymore. First of all, we need a loop cut right here. We're gonna push that all the way back to make sure this part is nice and tight. Then we're going to add a loop cut over here. Then we're going to select all these edges here, and we're going to follow the loop to select the same thing on the other side as well. Then I'm going to press Ctrl B, and I'll hold Shift to give this a small bevel. I'll scroll up once, and once I confirm this tiny little bevel, I'll change the shape to 1. Now we have a nice sharp edge on this part right here. And I'm also going to add a loop cut over here because I want this to be a little bit sharper as well. Here's something else that you can do when you're trying to make your edges sharper when using subdivision surface. Select the edges that you want to make sharp. So I'm going to select the sharp part of the blade. I'll press N to open this little menu on the side here in edit mode, and I'll set the mean crease to 1. As you can see now, it's completely sharp. I'll do the same thing on the edges around here. I have some more edges here at the top which I want to make sharp, so I'll select them to mean crease 1, and boom, we have a beautiful looking blade. We also need to add some crease to these edges over here, so we're going to select all the edges around the back side of the knife, and these edges at the tip here, mean crease 1, and we're good to go. Look at how beautiful that looks. Now we can go to Object, Shade Smooth, and we're good to go. The blade looks beautiful. So the model is finished. Now we're gonna add some materials to make this look realistic. I'm only gonna have to download one texture for this object, and that's gonna be the wood for the handle. I can make the other shit myself, and I'm gonna show you how I'm gonna do that. Now I'm over here on textures.com, and I just typed in wood into the search, and it gives me a bunch of wood materials. I don't really care about the color of the material. I just care about the patterns on the wood. I can take care of everything else myself. I like this one right here. I know it's supposed to be black. We're gonna make it black, and it's also supposed to be shinier. We're gonna make it shiny. So I'm gonna download the 3 texture maps that we have right here. We got our albedo, normal, and roughness maps. Now I'm looking at my fucking knife, and I have a feeling that there's gonna be a little metal piece over here. I feel like this metal piece is going to separate the top wooden part and the bottom wooden part. So I'm gonna take this edge, Control B, Shift, and I'll make a little separation right here. This way I can apply a different material to this area. Now in edge select mode, I'm gonna Alt right click this one and Shift Alt right click this one. Make sure you're not in vertex select mode. If you're in vertex select mode, you're also gonna select the edges in the middle. We don't wanna select those. We just wanna select the edges. Once we do that, I'm also going to select the edges on the inside of this little gap right here. The reason I'm selecting this is because I'm about to press Ctrl E, mark seam, and this is going to mark the seam so I can UV unwrap this shit. I don't really care about UV unwrapping this back part over here, so I can take all that geometry again, Ctrl E, clear seam. I'm gonna use a different way of projecting the texture on this. One way to clear this entire piece of any UVs is to select some geometry at the end here and press Ctrl plus, Ctrl plus, Ctrl plus, and do that a couple of times until we select this entire object. And that way I can press Ctrl E, mark seam, and it's gonna be completely cleared of any seams. Now we're gonna switch to the shading editor, and this is where the magic happens. We're gonna add a new material, and first of all, we're just gonna create basic, simple versions of our materials, just so we can get a little preview of what this is gonna look like. So on the handle, I'm gonna add a new material, that's gonna be black. On the blade, I'll add a new material. For the blade, I have to increase the metallic value and reduce the roughness to almost 0. When you're previewing a material like this, you might wanna change your HDRI. So change the environment to something that makes it look nice so you can get a better overview and feeling for what this is gonna look like. I like to use this orange one right here. You can also download some from the internet, so just make sure it's something that looks nice. If you have a shitty one, you're not gonna even wanna continue because it looks horrible. I'm gonna apply this same metallic material to this part as well. And since we have the bottom of the handle cut off by a loop of seams, I can just go to face select mode, press L, and I can instantly select just this part, and I can now add a separate material to just this. So I'm gonna go to the material tab, I'll press the little plus button. That's going to add a new material slot for this object. So the handle is an example of an object which has multiple materials on it. It's the same object, it's the same mesh, but it has multiple different materials. So we need to have multiple material slots in this object. Currently we just got a black material, but we added a new slot, and in that new slot we can load this metallic shit, and then we can click assign, and that's gonna assign it to all the selected geometry. I'm also going to assign this to this loop here that I created here in the middle. Now this is basically what our knife is going to look like. But of course we're gonna make these materials a bit more realistic. So first of all, let's add the wood texture. Let's switch to the wood material. Let's go over here and edit the wood material. We're gonna rename that shit to wood. And while we're at it, let's rename the metal to metal. Now in my wood material, I need to load my texture. So I can easily do that by pulling out my file browser, and I can just click and drag and drop this picture that I downloaded from the internet. And if I plug this into the base color, now it's going to appear on the handle. It currently looks like shit because it's not mapped properly, but we're gonna map this in a second. So we already have our UVs unwrapped. So we're going to press L to select the top part of the knife and L to select the bottom part of the knife. This is only going to work if you're in face select mode, because if you're in face select mode and you press L above a surface, it's going to select that entire surface only up until the seams. So if the entire surface is cut off by some seams, which it is as we can see over here, it's only going to select that surface. So in this case, it's only selecting this material. You can also select just one face and press Shift G, select similar material. And that's gonna select all the faces which have the same material applied to them. Now we're gonna press U, we're gonna click unwrap, and that's going to UV unwrap this object. In the UV editing window, we can see what's going on. These two surfaces have been unwrapped and we can see them in 2D over here. I don't like the way the wood is currently projected on this object, so I'm going to rotate these by 90 degrees. When you rotate them, just make sure to put them back into the picture properly so they're not sticking out of the frame. But all these textures that you download from textures.com in the PBR section, they're all seamless, so it doesn't matter if it's sticking out anyway, it's not going to be a problem. If you don't have a seamless texture, then it's going to be a problem. You can also rescale these or shape them differently or do whatever you want. I wouldn't recommend fucking with the shape of this though. You just rotate them or scale them up and down. If you reshape them, you're going to get some distortion, which is going to give you trouble down the line. So just use whatever your UV map gave you. If you have weird bending and stretching and all this, then your UV unwrapping is fucked up. You gotta go watch a video about how to properly UV unwrap stuff. Now I'll go back to my shading tab and I want to make this wood black. So I'll move this thing to the side, but it's still connected. I'm gonna go to Shift A, search, hue, saturation, value. This is a node that I can use to control the hue, saturation, and the value of the color output of this node, which in this case is the texture. So if I change the hue, it's going to change the color. You can make it blue, you can make it red, you can make it yellow, you can make it whatever you want. Let's say we want to make it blue. I can change the saturation so the intensity of the color is going to be greater. I can also make it completely black and white, which is what I'm going to do in a second, and the value is going to control the overall brightness of the texture. In this case, I don't really care about the hue because my saturation is going to be 0 anyway, so the color is not going to be visible. The value is going to be set to something pretty low to make this a bit darker. You can also add a bright contrast node, and that's going to allow you to control the contrast or the brightness of your texture. I don't really like how this node works, so I don't usually use this. Now we're going to load up a roughness map the same way we loaded the texture. We're going to bring that up, change the color space to non-color, and plug that shit into roughness. As you can see, there's hardly any difference. This is almost the same as just controlling the roughness here. Another way to do this is to duplicate this node, click on this number right here, then change the color space to non-color, and you can plug this into the roughness. Now you basically made your own roughness map. You can change the features of the roughness map by adding a bright contrast node. So if you increase the contrast, for example, there's going to be a bigger difference between the blacks and the whites in the roughness map, which is going to make the texture look a little bit different. You can also make it brighter or darker to control how shiny it is. I like how it looks when we increase the contrast a little bit, but then I'm also going to add a clear coat, and I'm going to add a little bit of clear coat roughness. I think this looks pretty damn nice. The clear coat is basically adding a layer of polish onto this object. Now let's get to the blade itself. When we're UV unwrapping shit, you always want to apply your subdivision surface modifier. Be careful when you're applying modifiers like this, because that's going to completely change your mesh, and you can't undo this anymore. It's not going to be that easy to change the shape of this anymore. So only apply modifiers when you're completely sure that you're not going to change this object anymore in edit mode. In this case, I'm sure, so I don't care. Let's just keep going. Now I have a lot more geometry and I can be a lot more confident in how I'm UV unwrapping this. If we look at a reference image, we're going to see there's essentially two different materials on this blade. One material is on the cheek of this knife, the flat surface, which is just some smooth steel. But this part over here, it's been sharpened, so it looks like brushed steel. So it's a slightly different texture. This is why we're going to have to separate these two areas, and we're going to do that using our seams. So I'm going to select this edge loop over here and on the underside as well. I'm going to mark this as a seam, and I'm going to select the rest of the edges which lead all the way up to this bevel that we created earlier. Make sure that you do this at the bottom as well. Mark those as seams, and also select the bevel that goes all the way to the front of the knife. And I'm going to use my brush select tool, which I activate with C, to deselect these edges which are behind this part. I'll also mark that as a seam. I'm also going to mark some seams at the top of the knife here, and one seam that goes along the sharp part of the blade. I'm also going to have to unwrap this, so I'm going to mark some seams on this part as well. I'm not going to talk to you too much about marking seams and which seams you have to mark to unwrap your models. That will be a whole different tutorial. You can type into YouTube Aryan UV unwrapping tutorial. I made a pretty beginner-friendly tutorial for how you can mark your seams for anything. So if you're confused right now, go watch that and come back. It's going to help you a lot. I want to test whether I marked the seams correctly. So I'm going to do what's called a UV test on this. I'll add a new image texture node. I'll generate a new image in this image texture node. I'll name it UV test. Set the generated type to UV grid, and click OK. Now we can plug this into the base color, and once we unwrap this with U, we can go to the shading view, and we're gonna see the pattern on this knife. I'm gonna disable the metallic property so it's a little bit easier to see this. As you can see, the UV grid is perfectly distributed across this object. If our UV map was fucked up, we would have some weird bending and twisting and distortion on this object. Right now we don't have any of that, so we're doing pretty good. Let's delete this and add the metallic back. I'm going to add a new material slot to this blade. I'll load up the metal material again, and I'll press on this little double page shit to duplicate this material. So I'm gonna name the second material brushed metal. Currently this is exactly the same material as the first one, but we're gonna change that in a second. Now I'm going to use L in face select mode to select the sharp part of the knife. Make sure you do it on both sides of the knife. And I'm going to assign the brushed metal to this part. Now it still looks the same, so we can't tell what the difference is, but if we change the properties for this material, you're gonna notice what I'm talking about. So here's how we're going to make this look brushed and sharpened. I'm gonna change my HDRI because this one's a bit dark, so I can't really see what's going on. I'm gonna pick something like this tree shit because I have some textures in the reflections, so I can see the texture a little bit better. So here's how you create brushed metal. I'm going to add a new noise texture node. This noise texture node color is going to be plugged into the roughness of the brushed metal material. So this noise texture, which is currently basically just a cloud texture, it has some dark spots, some light spots. This acts as a roughness map, which means some parts are more rough, some parts are less rough. I'm gonna have to change the mapping for this. So press F4 in object mode, go to preferences, add-ons, type in node, and check the node wrangler add-on right here. Now you can select your noise texture node, press Ctrl T. It's gonna give you some more nodes that you can use to map this shit a little bit better. I'm gonna go with UV, and now the mapping for this noise texture node is gonna be based on the UV map that we created. It's kind of hard to see what's going on here at the moment, so I'm going to add a color ramp node, and that's going to control the gradient between the light and the dark shades of this texture map. As you can see, if I bring these markers closer together, you can see some parts of the texture are shinier, other parts are less shiny. Now we can increase the scale of this noise texture node, and I'm gonna make the white marker a little bit darker. Now it just kind of looks like it's a little bit stained. This is what we're going to use for the rest of the metal, so I might as well just copy this node setup and paste it into my first material and use that there. Because I want this kind of roughness on the rest of my steel. I think it looks pretty good, but this one we're gonna have to map a little bit different. Let's exaggerate this effect a little bit just so we can see the mapping, and we're going to have to change the scale on one of the axes only. So in this case, if I increase the scale on the y-axis, as you can see, it looks like we just have straight lines. And this starts to look a lot more like brushed steel. So if we just crank the y value to some crazy shit like 200-300, you can see where we're getting at with this. We still have to change the brightness of the colors in the color ramp node because that's going to control how shiny this object is going to be. I think this looks pretty good. Obviously, your particular scenario is going to be a little bit different, so you don't have to copy the exact settings that I'm using. It's just important that you understand how I'm doing this. Is this the best way to make brushed metal? Probably not. Does it work? Yes. So we're done. Now there's two more key details that we have to add to this knife. This is the type of shit that separates beginners from the pros. It's in the details that nobody feels like doing because you think it doesn't make a big difference, but it makes a huge fucking difference. And those two details are this. We have some type of text over here on the blade itself, and we have these two little dots which have a completely different material on them. So I'm gonna show you how to make both of those. Both of these are gonna be pretty tricky to make, so buckle up. In my wood material, I'm going to add a new image texture node. We're going to use this to create the marble shit in a second. So click on new to generate a new image and name this image marble mask. I'm gonna set the resolution to 2048 by 2048. Make sure the color is completely black. Now we're going to plug this color into the base color, and that's going to replace the previous texture that we had. Don't worry, we're gonna bring that back. This is something else. Watch. Now switch to the texture painting window. I don't know why it fucks up the textures like this. Just go to texture preview and make sure you pick the right image to paint on. So go to this little menu up here and click on marble mask. This is the image that we want to paint on. You also have to make sure that this image texture node is selected in your shading tab. Otherwise this shit is not going to work. So go back to texture paint and now you can use your brush to paint whatever you want onto this object. We're going to go to top view and we're going to paint over these two little dots. Currently our brush is way too big and it's too soft. So undo that, change your radius to something like 25 and scroll down on this little menu over here and change the fall off. I'm going to pick the last one because I want this to be pretty sharp. Maybe not that sharp because now it looks kind of ugly. So in fall off, we're gonna pick a different shape. I'm gonna take the pointy one and I'll move this vertex from the corner. I'll push it over here closer to the edge, but not quite to the end, so we have this smooth part on the fall off. This way, when we paint this, it's gonna be a little bit smoother. Now we can zoom out a little bit so our brush fits this little dot over here, and we're gonna paint right over that and the second dot as well. We now have two beautiful dots, and we're going to replace these two dots with a texture. It's probably a good idea to save this image because Blender likes to just fuck up whatever you texture painted, and the image sometimes just disappears for no reason. So go to image, save as, and save this in marble mask somewhere. Now we're gonna go back to shading, and we're going to use this black and white image to control where we're gonna have the wood texture and where we're gonna have the marble texture. The black parts of this image are going to be replaced with our wood texture, and the white parts of this texture are going to be replaced with the marble texture. So to do that, we need a mix node and change that from float to color. Now plug this marble mask thing into the factor and plug the result into the base color. So we now have colors A and colors B. Color A is defined by the black color, and color B is defined by the white. We can replace those with anything we want, so we're going to replace them with some custom textures. Since color A, the red one right here, this is supposed to be the wooden part, we're going to plug the wooden texture into color A. And the white dots, we can make those anything we want, so we're about to make our own marble texture. Let's move this shit to the side so we can have some more space here. Add a new noise texture node and plug the color into the color B. Now you're gonna see some colorful patterns on this little dot here. I don't know why Blender doesn't map these according to the UVs by default when you're using a noise texture node. So we're gonna select this node, press Ctrl T to add a node wrangler, and change this from generated to UV. Now this is gonna look a bit better. Next, add a color ramp node, and we're gonna bring these markers closer together. You can see how this is gonna start looking like a marble texture now. The marble texture has to have a slightly beige color for the white part, and maybe a very light blue for the other color. We're gonna add some more markers, and we're gonna place that behind here, and you can see how that's controlling the texture on the inner part. You can add a few more markers and change the colors. You can change the color to whatever you want. You can make a blue part, a red part, you can move these markers around. You're gonna be able to create some pretty cool textures with this feature. Now, I don't wanna spend any more time on this, but you can create some pretty damn cool effects on this. So the marble dots are out of the way. The last thing we need are these little letters that we have carved into the blade. So here's how you make some carved letters on your objects. I'm gonna open up PaintNet, but you can use any image editing program. It's gonna be the same shit. This is pretty simple. You can do this in any program. You probably don't even need a tutorial. You just need some very basic image editing tools. So just create a new image. Mine is gonna be 248 by 248. I'm going to add a new layer, and on that new layer, I'm going to use my text tool with a black color to write these letters. On this particular knife, it says Buck 1244 USA. So that's exactly what I'm going to type. I'm gonna increase the font a little bit. I'm gonna center this, and we're gonna type in BUCK, new line, 1244, new line, U.S.A. Even the font is looking pretty good for this, so we're gonna keep it. It would be a wise idea to even further increase the font size. And now here's what's gonna make a key difference. I'm gonna take the layer with the letters and I'll merge it down with the layer below. Then I'm going to go to Effects, Blurs, and I'll add just a little bit of blur. This is going to make a gradient between the black color and the white color. So when we use this as a height map, which we're about to do, it's gonna look a lot more natural. And let me show you how that works. Obviously, save this image as a texture, go back to Blender, select the blade, go to the shading tab, and open up the metal material, not the brushed metal, the regular metal. We're gonna drag and drop this image with the text into Blender, change the color space to non-color, then add a bump node, plug the color into the height and the normal from the bump node into the normal of the principal BSDF node. We can now see the letters on the material, but they're not mapped correctly. So let's map them. We're gonna go to the UV editing workspace and select only the areas which have the metal material, not the brushed metal. In the UV editor, we're gonna select everything, scale it down, and make sure that this entire UV map is on a white area. You don't want to have any of the text on this right now. Then we're gonna go to top view and use your box select with B to select the faces which are going to contain these letters. Now in your UV editor, you can separately control these two areas. So we're gonna scale those up and we're going to place them on top of the letters. First, let's take care of the top side, and then we're gonna do the same thing for the underside. Since we have the same material applied to this part that separates the blade from the handle, we're also gonna have to scale that UV map down and push it somewhere to a white corner. Now we're gonna go back to shading and we're going to reduce the strength in the bump map node because by default the bump map node is way too strong. So we can start from 0 and just keep adding some strength until it looks about right. We don't even need a tutorial, you just need some very basic image editing tools. So just create a new image. Mine is gonna be 248 by 248. I'm going to add a new layer, and on that new layer I'm going to use my text tool with a black color to write these letters. On this particular knife it says Buck 1244 USA. So that's exactly what I'm going to type. I'm going to increase the font a little bit. I'm going to center this and we're going to type in BUCK new line 1244 new line U.S.A. Even the font is looking pretty good for this, so we're gonna keep it. It would be a wise idea to even further increase the font size. And now here's what's gonna make a key difference. I'm gonna take the layer with the letters and I'll merge it down with the layer below. Then I'm going to go to Effects, Blurs, and I'll add just a little bit of blur. This is going to make a gradient between the black color and the white color. So when we use this as a height map, which we're about to do, it's gonna look a lot more natural. And let me show you how that works. Obviously, save this image as a texture, go back to Blender, select the blade, go to the shading tab, and open up the metal material, not the brushed metal, the regular metal. We're gonna drag and drop this image with the text into Blender, change the color space to non-color, then add a bump node, plug the color into the height and the normal from the bump node into the normal of the principal BSDF node. We can now see the letters on the material, but they're not mapped correctly. So let's map them. We're gonna go to the UV editing workspace and select only the areas which have the metal material, not the brushed metal. In the UV editor, we're gonna select everything, scale it down, and make sure that this entire UV map is on a white area. You don't want to have any of the text on this right now. Then we're gonna go to top view and use your box select with B to select the faces which are going to contain these letters. Now in your UV editor, you can separately control these two areas. So we're gonna scale those up and we're going to place them on top of the letters. First, let's take care of the top side, and then we're gonna do the same thing for the underside. Since we have the same material applied to this part that separates the blade from the handle, we're also gonna have to scale that UV map down and push it somewhere to a white corner. Now we're gonna go back to shading and we're going to reduce the strength in the bump map node because by default the bump map node is way too strong. So we can start from 0 and just keep adding some strength until it looks about right. Now I'm not gonna show you how I rendered this. Maybe I'm an asshole, but I already gave you enough value for free. If you wanna see more courses where I do full modeling projects, check out my Patreon. I got a tank course and we're doing a Lamborghini Countach interior modeling course. We're also gonna do the exterior later. If you wanna see more videos like this, let me know in the comments, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.